we're now going to narrow our focus to a kind of case study of Philadelphia. We are very fortunate to have Domenic Vitiello here with us, who is Assistant Professor of City Planning and Urban Studies at Penn. And he is going to talk about the history and demographics of immigration in Philadelphia. And I think even though not those of you in the room who are from Philadelphia, this is obviously of immediate relevance, but I think even for those of us who are not, getting a sense of how these issues play out in a local community from an urban planner's point of view and from a demographic point of view, and thinking about the way all of these demographic issues may relate to violence, to mental health, to social issues, is an opportunity for a really interesting conversation. So, again, I'm not going to do a long bio, but Professor Vitiello is at Penn, teaches courses on community development, food systems, immigration, and urban planning history. He also teaches at Penn's Urban Studies program and is a senior fellow of Penn's Center for Public Health Initiatives. He's both a urban planner and a historian, and his research focuses on community and economic development institutions, migration, and urban agriculture. He's done books, he teaches, he consults, and he's here to talk with us. So, Domenic, all yours. Come up here.
I've heard people say, I think it was originally a New Yorker article, right, that said something to the effect of the 1965 Immigration Act, right, which opened up our borders in the United States, was really, in some ways, the greatest act of food policy that Congress has ever taken. Right, so you heard I'm a planner and historian, and I'm not really a demographer, and I don't really work on violence, but I'll talk a little bit about violence because it's an important part of the history of not just this region's immigration, but immigration. And here's my outline. I'm sorry if a lot of this is pretty dark. I'm happy to share my slides, with you if that's helpful to look at, particularly some of the next slides, which may be not super legible. So I'm going to talk, yes, about a case study of both the city and region of Philadelphia, and the numbers I will show you are for a broader region. And I'll talk about the geography of migration and settlement within this metropolitan region, and give you some sort of examples across recent, what for me as a historian is recent history, really post-World War II history of migration to and settlement in the region, and including some what scholars call secondary migration away from the region, some of which had to do with violence people encountered here. And I'll talk a bit about different groups, quite diverse experiences of violence in both emigration, migration, moving, their settlement here, the evolution of their communities here or community formation, as well as relationships both within and between newcomer and receiving groups. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think is, in some ways, the violence of public policy towards certain immigrants. Can you read a little bit of the numbers there? Okay, so I'm talking about this big 14-county region. Let me say that in some ways, for those of you who are not from Philadelphia, some of the patterns that I'll show you are widely shared nationally. And I think when we talk, a bit in the second half of this presentation about the comparing different migrant groups, that's very relevant to New York or to some extent Minnesota, yes, certainly Baltimore, maybe Arizona a little less. I think I'm covering most of where you're from, at least to judge by the list, right? So in 1950, almost everybody on this list, particularly the top 10 foreign-born groups by nationality or national origin, they're old people, right, who came here for the most part before the Great Depression, right, and even many of them before the 1924 Immigration Act effectively closed our borders in the United States, right? The United States borders were to a great extent closed, limited to tiny quotas between the 1920s and the 1965 Immigration Act. So older, both in terms of age and in terms of when they came, right? Older European immigrants are here in 1950, but you start to see at the bottom of this this table, right? You see the small Puerto Rican community that starts to grow, and you see already a sizable African American population in this region. And I want to stress to you that in Philadelphia and most cities of particularly the northern and western United States, to a great extent, right? The great migration of African Americans, the second great migration of African Americans in really the World War II through 1960s period is probably the most important migration to your cities and regions. Certainly in Philadelphia, and for Philadelphia and Chicago and New York to a great extent, right? The great migration of Puerto Ricans, dwarfs many, and in Philadelphia, all of the subsequent immigration flows in the later 20th century. By 1970, this picture is not especially different. Yeah, we get the 1965 Immigration Act, but 5 years later, the only new group here in red, you probably can't see that, is Canadians, almost 14,000 of them. But you just saw the Puerto Rican community grow from 3,000 to over 25,000, and you just saw the African American community grow from a little over 500,000 to getting close to 1 million, and most of those migrants are coming to the city. And actually most of, to the extent that there are new European immigrants in this region in the 1950s and 60s and even 70s and today, most of those folks are moving to the suburbs. You may know already from today or from other things that the majority of immigrants today move to the suburbs, settle directly in the suburbs. And that's a big change from the historic pattern, not just of immigrants, but of people in the United States generally, living in cities across the 20th century at least, and then moving up, economically and out to the suburbs. That breaks that historic pattern. That does not mean that we don't still have immigrants coming to cities, right, to central cities. By 1980, some Greeks show up, some Indians, but if you're watching the numbers overall, the numbers of people, right, particularly in the top 10 sort of immigrant groups or foreign-born groups, Puerto Ricans are citizens, right? I hope you know that. But those numbers, don't grow substantially, right? Philadelphia, like other older Rust Belt cities, right? Older industrial cities that declined, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest, to a great extent today remains a low immigration region. I think it's fair to say, we said in a report a few years ago that Philadelphia is a re-emerging immigrant gateway, much like Minneapolis or a few other cities. But to a great extent, right, I think it's really important to understand that, if you want to understand immigrant communities in the second half of the 20th century, and including today in older Rust Belt cities, it's important to realize that they're not, by and large, huge communities of any particular nationality, and that has all sorts of huge implications, from people's real and perceived political influence to communities' capacity to fund and develop community institutions. So some Greeks and some Indians, small numbers, 10,000 more or less, here by 1980. The Puerto Rican community continues to grow. The African American community continues to grow. The white community does not in this region. We are a region of very flat, stagnant growth overall. By 1990, however, the picture starts to look a little different, right? Koreans are number 3 if you don't count the folks who don't specify where they were born abroad, and Vietnamese. Mostly refugees, but increasingly through family reunification, also immigrants are here, and Filipinos show up on the top 10 list. Puerto Ricans continue to grow, as they don't in New York or Chicago. In fact, one of the important dynamics of migration to this region, particularly in the last 20 or so years, has been that people coming from the New York metro area, right, have settled in Philadelphia, both Puerto Rican and immigrants. And that's in large part because you can make as much money in most jobs here, and our cost of living is substantially lower, not just than New York City, but than the New York metro region. 2000, the picture looks pretty different. We still have some old Germans and Italians there, but they're the only older European group. Ukrainians, and you know, we could lump folks from the former USSR in there as well. That would, you know, give us, you know, larger numbers of Soviet and post-Soviet, mostly Jewish refugees here, right? Large numbers. Chinese immigrants, both working class, your traditional view of Ellis Island immigrants, right? But also, right, one of the fundamental things to recognize about the history of immigration in the last half century is that since 1965, our preference, you know, preferences for immigration, right, for legal entry to this country as economic immigrants in a sense, or as immigrants, have fundamentally to do with two things. Tell me if I'm just repeating what you've already, you know, heard 3 times today. Okay, please do speak up. All right, are based on two things, and one is, in some ways, I think, like, really great to recognize. We have, in many ways, a rather humane immigration policy in this country, in that we favor family reunification as one of the 2 main bases of our immigration policy. The second is we, like every other country in the world, but not exclusively, to a great extent, unlike Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and parts of Europe, we are not exclusively or overwhelmingly focused, at least to date. This may change. We're not exclusively focused on just getting high-skilled, high-wage workers. If you go to Australia, right, you have to fill out a sort of 100-point form to, you know, for them to figure out whether you're high-skilled enough in particular, you know, high-end sectors of their economy to migrate to Australia. And that is becoming the basis of industrialized, wealthy nations' immigration policies in the world. And again, to a great extent in the United States, at least today, we remain as much focused on family reunification. Mexicans, I would submit, you know, and these again are figures for the region. For the city, it looks pretty similar, though the Europeans drop out. Indians, in the official numbers, are number 1. Mexicans, number 2. These are, you know, I'll say something in a minute about that. Puerto Ricans, again, continue to grow, right? And the 2010 figures look pretty similar. And I'm not going to show them to you in part because they're in some ways rather flawed at the level of this geography and at looking at particular groups. I could complain about the census to you all day, but I'll try to refrain from that, unless you want to talk about it later. I would submit that Mexicans are probably the largest group in this region. They are undercounted substantially everywhere in the United States. But Mexicans and Indians are the largest groups, both in the city and in the region. Vietnamese, Chinese, Koreans. Liberians show up on the list of the top 10 in the city, not in the region. And if you aggregated Africans, we'd have a substantial community of African migrants in the city and region. This chart is here just to show you that we were incredibly stagnant overall in the foreign-born, again at the regional level, through the mid-1990s, and then, like the rest of the United States, this chart could be, for the most part, reflecting the entire United States. There was a takeoff, right, in increase in again, you know, Latin American and Asian migration to the U.S. and to Philadelphia. As Philadelphia, hey, gained a service economy that was much more robust than it had been in previous decades. These are just figures for 2006. They again look pretty similar. I'll skip this slide. It just shows you how different, right, we are today, particularly in the top 10 foreign-born groups, than we were even just 40 years ago. I want to show you just one slide about people's jobs, right? Immigrants on the left, native-born folks on the right. I'll let you read it. It looks very similar, and it broadly, I think, makes the point that really both for the foreign-born and native-born, our economy, or our labor market in particular, is incredibly bifurcated between computer software engineers and doctors, right, and people being paid lousy wages, oftentimes without benefits, right, and immigrants are in both of those categories, right, and by the way, not only Chinese immigrants are in both of those categories, African immigrants are in both of those categories, though affluent Chinese folks tend to live in the suburbs, whereas professional class Africans live in the same neighborhoods as working class Africans, which are the same neighborhoods as working class African Americans. And so in an important way, right, racial segregation is reinforced for some immigrants more than others. I'll give you just quick pictures of the geography of immigration to this region. That doesn't tell me much. It just tells you a little bit about the concentration of immigrants. For those of you who don't know Philadelphia too well, there are high concentrations of immigrants, both in the neighborhoods around our downtown and in older working class neighborhoods, both within the city and on the edges of the city. And then there are a few high income residential suburbs on this map too that are darker. I like these maps a little better because I think they parse some of the diversity of the geography of immigrant settlement. Again, probably hard to read, but in the Mexican map on the upper left, you can almost undoubtedly see the huge concentration of Mexicans in the mushroom capital of the world around Kennett Square, which is an agricultural part of our region. Mexicans are dispersed a little more today than they were in this 2000 map, but again, concentrated in both the agricultural parts of our region and in working class neighborhoods adjacent to either our downtown or adjacent to affluent suburbs where they work in construction and restaurants and domestic service, right? Really as a hugely important part of the labor force in our rather robust service economy in this region. Indians in the bottom right are much more dispersed overall, but mainly in higher wealth residential suburbs. I love this map, mainly because it's a mess. You're not supposed to be able to read it, right? But it basically tells you that that picture of where immigrants concentrate. It just doesn't capture the diversity, right, of immigration to this region. Again, I'll give you the slides later if you like. I show you this map, and I think it's my last map, and then I'll show you some pictures to reinforce that in many ways, though, Philadelphia remains a black and white city, particularly compared to, say, New York or Miami or Los Angeles or Chicago. And it's really important to understand the politics of immigration, right, to realize that we are not just a minority-majority city, but one that remains very much black and white compared to the more diverse immigrant destinations. And again, Puerto Rican migration, in so many ways, influences the politics of Latin American migration to this region. And probably the most highly publicized post-World War II race riot, or the first highly publicized post-World War II race riot in this city in the white press, right, was a riot in which working class whites attacked Puerto Ricans moving into their neighborhood after industrial jobs had left. In many ways, an experience shared with African Americans as well, much as residential segregation and the violent enforcement of the color line, right, was a shared experience among African Americans and Puerto Ricans, right, who, when they moved into a block that was all white, right, particularly within someone's Irish or Italian parish boundaries, right, would experience not just bricks through the window, but entire home invasions, right, people running into your home and beating you up and telling you you really can't rent here or buy here. And so, residential segregation, if you don't know, has an incredibly violent history of being enforced at the very personal level. This may be your image of Chinatown in the sort of southern edge of Philadelphia's Chinatown. At the northern edge of the boundaries of Chinatown, I'm going to give you a few, quick examples of different communities in the city. There's this huge defensive wall, and here's the wall on the right with the mural I'm about to show you, which is right across from the wall. I love this mural. It tells the story of Chinese migration to the United States at the top, right? Chinese workers came here to the west to work in agriculture, to build railroads. After those railroads were built, and after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which essentially forbid the migration of women and enabled states and localities to create more localized laws. Those laws and people's migration to cities created Chinatowns, right, which were forcibly segregated through zoning and other means, right, by the state. They are wonderful parts of our downtowns and increasingly our suburbs, but particularly the downtown historic Chinatowns were created out of a legacy of state violence. With some more state violence, arriving after the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1942. And just in case you think the United States is special, Australia had Asian Exclusion Acts, New Zealand had them, Canada had their own version. This is a very shared history among the major industrialized immigrant receiving nations in the world. The era of urban renewal, you see the highway there, blew through, or proposed essentially in every major Chinatown in US cities to destroy Chinatowns with large-scale redevelopment projects, whether they were highways or where we are right now, Independence Mall urban renewal area, took out the eastern 2 blocks of Chinatown. The highway ran through our Chinatown. Our downtown mall, which was an urban renewal project, the gallery at Market East and the parking lots next to it, took out the southern edge of Chinatown, particularly the parking lots. And then on the west, by the 1990s, we built a convention center that surrounds our Chinatown entirely. If you've been to other Chinatowns in the US, DC is a great example of a Chinatown that's, academics sort of arrogantly deride as an ethnic Disneyland, because it has Chinese characters on the Starbucks and the Chili's, and it has a gate, but not enough ethnic Chinese people or other Asians to support a local supermarket. Urban renewal destroyed vast portions of Chinatowns. I want to also point out that a not insubstantial number of Chinese restaurants, right, which outnumber McDonald's in this country, at least in inner cities, are located in very poor neighborhoods where the Chinese people, living in what I call the sort of yellow sign restaurants, right, live very isolated lives, not just behind bars and and bulletproof glass, right? But as people who don't really participate to a great extent in the communities of social support, right, that Chinatowns are, right? And so there are plenty of Chinese as well as other immigrants, but I think this is especially true of this sort of group of folks who run these sorts of stores, who live incredibly isolated lives and typically live above their restaurants, right? Again, very much locked up. I want to talk very briefly about Southeast Asian resettlement in Philadelphia. Obviously, the United States' role in Southeast Asia and what we call the Vietnam War, right, was an act of tremendous violence, right, that drove a great deal of emigration that I will hardly even gloss over. I think it's in some ways ironic and tragic that in the university where I teach, our West Philadelphia neighborhood became in the late 1970s and early 1980s one of the main destinations for Southeast Asian refugee resettlement after we had helped develop Agent Orange, right, to defoliate Southeast Asian forests to make it easier to bomb them. the Hmong, right, a group of mostly rural, sort of highland folk from highland Laos, who fought with the United States, for the United States along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, were airlifted and resettled, substantially in the United States. In Philadelphia, by 1980, we had something like 5,000 Hmong living in mainly West Philadelphia and Upper North Philadelphia, a neighborhood mainly called Logan. 3 years later, less than 1,000? I hear three explanations when I do research for that. The most important and positive one being that the Hmong tribal leadership was resettled in California and Minnesota and Wisconsin, and people re-centralized or rebuilt their communities by moving around. And secondary migration in that sense is very normal, right? But it can also be driven by violence, and certainly it was from Philadelphia. The Hmong encountered just horrific, just street-level neighborhood, on their blocks, violence against people, against property, such that they felt they couldn't go to work, they couldn't park on their block, they couldn't walk down their block to their houses. And that was certainly a driver in people leaving here, right? The third reason I hear is much quieter, in many ways much smaller. Can you show me how many minutes? Take your hand. Yeah, 5. Cool. Thanks. Social workers, right, at the resettlement agencies also said to the Hmong in the early 1980s, as we had a recession in this country, right, and as our welfare system was being cut quite dramatically, said, by the way, Philadelphia's industrial economy was crashing in the 1970s and 80s. We lost 100,000 manufacturing jobs in the 1970s and something, not insubstantial in the 80s. As our economy, regionally and locally was crashing too, so, social workers at resettlement agencies said to the Hmong, hey, the welfare systems remain more generous in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I don't wish to suggest that was a major motivation for people moving, but resettlement agencies and the State Department in the early 1980s developed a whole set of theories and classifications to understand what was an affected area or an impacted area or a sensitive area, meaning could cities absorb particularly Southeast Asian refugees effectively, or should we encourage people to go elsewhere? We also had some horrible cases, not so much for the Hmong, but in West Philadelphia, these apartment houses, which look nice today, were places where African Americans were organizing to oppose, really abusive landlords whose buildings had been condemned, essentially, and the landlords used the condemnation of those buildings as an excuse to evict their African American, increasingly activist tenants, and went to the resettlement agencies and said, hey. At a moment in the 1980s when many people are coming very quickly from Cambodia in particular, said, hey, we can house all large numbers of people and put people into these and other buildings, including buildings in Logan that also had violations or were even condemned. And so landlords in many ways, right, in this declining city, right, perpetuated, I think in certain ways, acts of violence, right, towards refugees. And really undermined African American activism, one part of helping to create what were really tense and difficult and often violent relationships between African American receiving communities and particularly new Asian refugees whom everybody knows, get $5,000 as soon as they step off the plane, right? To start a new business, and they've got all sorts of benefits that nobody else has, and so of course that's a myth, right? But those sorts of myths are incredibly powerful in receiving communities even today, and so you won't be able to see this, but these are maps showing secondary migration within this region, right? That as particularly Southeast Asians moved out of African American neighborhoods. I want to tell you a nice story. Those of you from New York, or even if you were just paying attention after September 11th, 2001, know about violence towards Sikhs and also towards people who are actually Arabs, and towards mosques. In Philadelphia, we have a really vibrant and wonderful interfaith movement that not every city or region has, but that essentially reached out to the main immigrant mosques in this region. We also have a large African American Muslim community here that is an important part of this story. And essentially went down to, by the way, this is the city's major sort of immigrant mosque, particularly for Arab mosque for Palestinians and Lebanese. Basically right after 9/11 said, we want to come down and sit in our lawn chairs, on the sidewalk outside your mosque, and make sure there isn't any nonsense, right? And violence. And something that led to, and the attention to this mosque in particular after that led to, was this is sort of what it looked like, right? It's a big old sort of boring warehouse building. It got a totally new facade as a sort of public art, sort of interfaith, sort of community-based art project that yielded essentially ultimately this facade. I'm going to stop there and not tell you about the aliens coming to South Philadelphia, but you may know one of our most famous spokesmen on immigration. If you're from Philadelphia, you get this. If not, if you want to ask me, I'll explain. But this is South Philadelphia. These are, I'll just wrap up in 1 minute. These are two of the leaders of the national movement for immigration restriction, right? Darryl Metcalf on the left and Lou Barletta, the former mayor of Hazleton, on the right. They are, state legislator and congressmen today who helped make Pennsylvania one of the leading centers of, this is from your newspaper, right? One of the leading centers of immigration restriction, particularly illegal immigration relief acts passed by towns, right? And I'll leave the story, I think a very interesting story, but of African American relations we can talk about in discussion if you want to.
Give it a few minutes up here. That was very cool, and I think adding the element of structural violence is very important. I was struck by the sort of layers from national policy down to the misbehavior of individual landlords as drivers of the particular creation of communities and conflict among and within communities. That's clearly part of the story. But also that the bit at the end about the sort of solidarity response around the Arab American community, the Islamic community, Muslim community here. Talk a little bit more about that. How did that happen? It wasn't just spontaneous.
No. It's just part of a larger, long history and tradition in this city, which, if you know its early history, was founded in many ways more legitimate ways than other British colonies on a true principle of religious freedom, this has been a religiously diverse region, with many radical activist faiths, not just Quakers, but you've probably never heard of Swedenborgians unless you're a historian of religion, but through some rather fringe, but I think important radical civil rights organizations and social welfare organizations tied to them, some of which we even call cults, like if you've heard of Father Divine, I'm talking Philadelphia speak, but also, I think we were one of the centers of the sanctuary movement in the 1980s, right? The interfaith movement that said, hey, the United States is violating its own 1981 Refugee Act by not granting refugee status and asylum to people fleeing the civil wars of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, right? And of course, the United States politically couldn't do that because we were so involved in those wars, right? But today we have a new sanctuary movement that doesn't have the same sort of legal claim, but is taking a moral and ethical and religious or sort of interfaith stance against our deportation policy and trying to make this city, among many other cities, effectively a sanctuary city in which the local government and the police department ignore federal immigration and customs enforcement directives to collaborate in deportation policy, right?
What's the region going to look like in a decade from now? What do you think from what you can tell, and there's always unknowables in this, but there's known knowns and unknown unknowns, as Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld used to say. What do we know about how this region is going to look in the coming period?
Yeah, so beware of asking historians questions about the future, but I think to the extent that our recent trend of service economy growth, and continues, we're going to continue to have, particularly economic opportunities for migrants. To the extent that our medical and pharmaceutical sectors, which are in many ways our leading sort of high-paid sectors in this region, mostly in the suburbs, but in terms of medical centers and universities, right, meds and eds, they're in many ways the basis of large parts of every American city's economy today. They'll continue to create opportunities for professional class or higher wage immigrants, right? Just being at a university, which is the largest private employer in this region, right? And numbers 2 and 3 are universities and medical schools too. I think we seem to be, in part because of our own fiscal pressures, importing a significantly increasing number of particularly Asian students. Not that they will stay here, but that's a not insubstantial part of this region and other regions' immigration, right?
Questions from the room? Somebody who hasn't asked a question in a while? Or at all today? Come on, guys, it's a room full of journalists.
I'm a teacher, I can just call on
All
someone.
right, go.
Would you talk more about the relationship with African Americans?
Between Africans and African Americans, or generally African Americans?
Just what you were getting to at the end.
Yeah, I was going to. That's a slightly smaller, but still vast topic, right? But thank you. Yeah, so you might assume because of skin color and some presumed shared experience that Africans and African Americans might get along better than particularly African Americans and other immigrants, right? About which I said a little bit, right? And that's not necessarily a correct assumption to make. In many ways, Africans and African Americans have incredibly different experiences, right? I think it's really interesting, though, that the largest group of African refugees and immigrants in this city and region is Liberians, who are the one, in some sense, U.S. colony, right? But
Anyway.
yeah, U.S. creation, right? And so we don't have the same relationship with the rest of Africa that colonizing European powers did and do. That's where most African migrants go, by the way, right? Is either to other African countries first and foremost, but then to Europe. But we have this really interesting set of tensions, including around African Americans perceiving Africans as primitive people, right? And also as immigrants who are advantaged in ways that African Americans have historically not been, right? Have historically been discriminated against and disadvantaged. Africans do not share the legacy of slavery. They sometimes don't understand racism in the same ways, right? Generally don't understand racism in the same ways, particularly early on when they come here, as African Americans certainly do. And yet, as I said, Africans, both high wage and low wage, right, working class and wealthier, live in African American communities overwhelmingly in the city and the working class suburbs, and so live in the same places and spaces. And there's been some pretty horrible violence, particularly of African Americans toward Africans. I showed you an image of Jacob Gray, who very sadly in the 2000s was, I think sort of Philadelphia's most famous immigrant. If Joey Vento, the sort of cheesesteak king, whose sign, when ordering speaking, please speak English, this is America, right, aroused great ire for its discrimination or presumed discrimination against particularly Mexicans who live in his neighborhood, right? I'll get to you in a sec. You want to add something about Joey Vento before I?
If you think that there's a parallel between the way the African American community is towards African immigrants and the way the Puerto Rican community has tensions with the Mexican immigrants.
And we'll have to make this one the last question.
That's a fabulous, fascinating question. I think there are some. I'd be glad to follow up with you. I think that's a really astute observation. I would say, however, that to a great extent, while the Puerto Rican community has really struggled to, in a sense, incorporate Mexicans into its political bloc, into its social service institutions and their programs for a whole variety of reasons, some of which are cultural, some of which are personal, some of which are really based on geography. Mexicans live in South Philly, Puerto Ricans mostly North Philly, and some of which are political, right? It's hard to offer state subsidized social services, oftentimes, some of them at least, to people who are unauthorized immigrants, not all services. But to get back to Africans and to answer the other side of your question, I think there has emerged, particularly since the mid-2000s in Philadelphia, in many ways a very healthy, a wonderful politics of shared prosperity among African and African American residents and Caribbean, right? There are Pan-African institutions, some of which look on the surface like just Liberian-led organizations or just African American-led organizations, some of which are more sort of the Coalition of African Communities in Philadelphia, some of which look like they don't do anything but sit around and talk with one another. Organizations, that just, they even say they do, serious social service and job development, economic development, community development. They don't do any of those things, but they do something that is in some ways much more important on a basic level and is perhaps a prerequisite to doing those things, right, in those communities, which is getting people to know one another, right, and to build communities of trust and shared interest, and again, this sort of politics of shared prosperity, which I would argue, play out in some sort of actionable and material ways in community and economic development. But I'll end there.
That, I think, is a great place to end. So, Domenic, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.